You're listening to That Music Podcast with Bryson Tarbet, the curriculum designer and educational consultant behind That Music Teacher and the Elementary Music Summit. Each week, Bryson and his guests will dive into the reality of being an elementary music teacher and how music can truly be transformative in the lives of the students you serve. Show notes and resources mentioned in this episode can be found at thatmusicteacher.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to That Music Podcast. I am really excited to dive into a really cool topic. Today, we have Alessandra Santaguida here with us, and we're going to talk all about project-based learning, specifically for middle school general music. So, Alessandra, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. I love this topic. I could talk about it forever and ever and ever. So thank you for giving me the space to do that. I'm so excited to chat tonight.
I am really excited to dive into this personally because I taught up to sixth grade, but we were at like a weird middle school, as a fifth and sixth grade school. So like there was a huge even just like a culture shift in like the what my students were kind of expecting. So projects were like super lifesaver, and I can't wait to dive in deeper and hopefully help out some that might be at that upper elementary level, but also that seventh and eighth grader kind of level. So before we get too far into it, can you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your experience in the middle school general music arts world?
Awesome. Yeah. So like you said, my name's Alessandra. I'm a K to grade 8 teacher of the arts. I'm based just outside of Toronto, Canada. So I am Canadian. I might use some different terminology than some people might be used to hearing. And I teach pretty much every student at my school. I'm at a big, busy school, over 700 students. I used to see my intermediates, which are my grade 7s and 8s, twice a week. So for 80 minutes. Now I see everyone for 40 minutes a week. And I mostly focus on music, but I also, depending on the year, I've done dance, I've done drama, I've done a little bit of everything. So this would have been my 9th year teaching. I'm actually on maternity leave right now. I just had my second baby. He's almost 4 months. And so, but otherwise, I've been at my school for a long time. I've tried lots of things. I'm excited to get into tonight, like the lessons I've learned and how I've adjusted my teaching practice in order to best cater to my students and what's really worked for me, and just tried and true projects and ideas that I feel have worked in my favor.
Yeah, I can't wait to dive into that because middle school, my parents are both retired middle school teachers, and you have to be a specific type of person to really thrive in that environment. Just like as a person, but then on the practical side of like how we prepare our teachers that are licensed in such a broad range, like let's be honest, no one's teaching middle school general music. I'm curious, other than the kind of that aspect, why, do you think of any reasons why teachers might struggle with the middle school age?
Yeah, I think it's no surprise. Probably the most challenging aspect would be challenging student behaviors, right? And that often comes from either a lack of buy-in. Sometimes if you are, like in my role, for example, I'm not their homeroom teacher. I see them 40 minutes a week, right? And so having really strong relationships with my students, and I have been at my school for multiple years, so that has definitely helped and worked in my favor because I've built relationships with my students now, since they were in grade 2, now they're in grade 7 or 8. So we do know each other. That's been a big factor. But I definitely think, experiencing challenging behaviors or just teaching students or having them understand why music is valuable to begin with, right? And having that piece, something that they understand and appreciate in order to move forward together.
Yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. So before we get too far into the weeds,
we've all been there.
Yeah. Before we get too far into the weeds, can you give us like a high level definition of, for you at least, what is project-based learning? Just so we're all on the same page for the rest of this conversation.
For sure. So to me, project-based learning is a student-centered approach where students are at the center of their learning. And essentially they're going through the stages of the project. And as they do that, through that experience, they're developing their knowledge and their skill set through the active exploration in every stage of the project. So project-based learning as well also you go through the steps of it, but also emphasizes the creation of a tangible product at the end. So the focus is creating the product itself, but then as they go through those steps, they're able to expand on their learning and grow in their learning as well. The project is kind of the medium in which their learning happens.
So we talked a little bit about some of the challenges that we've seen in, why it can be tricky to teach middle school. So I'm curious what you've noticed how project-based learning addresses some of these challenges.
Absolutely. So I find project-based learning and some of the projects that I've done with my students just an incredible vehicle to really increase engagement in my classroom. So I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but I actually did my bachelor's in music therapy. That was my first degree. I worked at a children's hospital for a little bit, and then I went back, did my master's and my teaching degree altogether. So that mindset kind of fuels a lot of my teaching practice. It's kind of where I came from. So when I approach project-based learning, I'm really thinking about how can I make this relevant for my students? How can I have them feel a sense of autonomy where they feel like they're at the center of their learning? And then also, especially with this age group, they want to feel competent. Like they want to feel like they're good at it, they understand it, and they're able to move forward. So those are actually like research supports that. When we hit those three things, when we hit autonomy, competence, and relatedness with our students, and we help them feel those three things, that will increase their intrinsic motivation. That will increase their want to participate and their engagement in what you're doing, right? And project-based learning can address all three of those things. And because it does that, that in itself, it's the vehicle to increase engagement, increase your buy-in, and hopefully decrease a lot of those challenging behaviors you might be seeing in your classroom.
Yeah, and I've seen this. I've definitely seen this completely in practice. I've had classes of students that were a little rough, a little rough around the edges. Just I needed a little extra love, a little extra oomph. But doing something like a project, I found oftentimes was really helpful getting them engaged and getting them involved in music in a different way. That for me was a little uncomfortable because it wasn't the typical like Kodai, let's do the things and then let's sing about it. like it was definitely kind of a little bit of mindset shift for me. But I saw the success of the other side. So I would love to hear about some of your successes that you've seen. Can you give us an example of maybe one of your favorite PBL projects that you've used in the middle school classroom?
Yeah. And yeah, actually, before I get into that, I think what you're saying is so interesting that there's this kind of gap between what we learn as educators and then what our students actually need. And, I encourage teachers to think about it from the lens that I need to meet my students where they're at. I need to, love them for who they are and how they already show up in music. And then once I can build that relationship with them, which we can do through some of these projects, I'll get to it in a moment, then we can move together and help them progress in their learning. And then give them some of these new experiences we want to give them as well. Right. So
I
it's
cannot
a
agree
bit,
with that more.
it's a little bit of a shift, I think, in terms of sometimes what we're taught, but it can, it pays off tenfold. But in terms of a project, I have tons that I've done that I love. One I really love is a music themed podcast project that I've done with my students. And I actually started this during the pandemic when I was teaching online, but I've continued it with a lot of my students even now in person. And essentially, I lay out all the steps, but the main question I give them is that you can do any topic you want. It just has to relate to music in some kind of way. Like that's it. You pick something you're passionate about, pick something you want to learn more about. This is going to give you the space and the time to do that. Pick something you want to become an expert in, and then you're going to create a podcast episode being an expert in whatever topic you've chosen, as long as it relates to music. And so I often do my projects with this idea of freedom within structure. So the project itself is the structure. I give really clear deadlines, really clear expectations. I'm constantly giving them feedback as we go along. We can get into that process a little bit more too. But essentially, they're choosing what they want to learn about. And then as we go through that process, I'm pushing them to go further in their learning and their thinking. So I've had students do topics like music and mental health. I've had students do the history of the guitar. I've had students even do my top 5 favorite songs of the year, and then they're analyzing the different elements of music and the meaning behind it and what parts of the song that they like. They're doing a full analysis on how they've ranked those songs. So there's so much to choose from. I've had students do like cultural pieces of music that they want to talk about and how it's representative of the culture that they're from. And it's just such a beautiful example of when you give students the space to bring in their own interests and show up as their authentic selves in music, it can surpass what you think they're able to do, to give you, right? It can surpass what you might have assumed they would be able to produce for you, because now they're invested, now they're showing themselves, it's relevant to them, and it's a beautiful thing. I love it.
Yeah, and I think sometimes as music educators, we get way too focused on performance, even when it's not performance for like a concert, like just the act of like making music together and sharing music, like totally important. Don't get me wrong, but I think sometimes we focus all on that and we don't do any of like we like touch on the reflecting standards like after a concert or something, right? We barely touch on it. We don't really get to that deep level thinking about like, why do we like these songs? Why, you brought up so many good points because you mentioned like bringing things in that they're listening to outside of the classroom, which is just a great way to instantly increase engagement. So I'm sure there are some teachers that are listening that are maybe they want to get started, or maybe they're like, there's this never happening, because they're just so overwhelmed, or they feel a little hesitant that it's going to be such a dramatic shift that it's just not, it's not going to work. So what advice would you give to those teachers that kind of have a little bit of overwhelm or just aren't quite sure it's going to work?
For sure. And like you said, the performance part of music is so integral to music education. Like, you definitely should do, music making together. But I also, again, want to encourage teachers to think about, how can I allow multiple ways for my students to show up and to show success in my classroom? I've had, a student who just performing is not their thing, right? And they want to do well and they put their full effort in, and just performing is not their zone of genius, right? So think of it when you introduce projects or some other written pieces, or I guess less performance-based aspects of music, you're really giving your students multiple ways to show their strengths and their learning, right? Aside from just being performance-based. So I would say, if you're starting, start simple, start small. You don't have to do this big, grand, inquiry-based project if you don't feel comfortable with that yet. You can do, for example, I do a project with my grade 6s almost every year. It's called the Meaning in Music Project. And essentially we talk about how music shows up in our society, how it's integrated in our world. If we go through our day, where do we hear music? We hear the national anthem. You might hear music when you go to dance class, before you play in a hockey game, when you watch movies, when you are at the mall shopping, right? How is music integrated into our society? And then with that project, it's a quick, like 3-week project I do with my students. Essentially, they pick one song that they feel is timeless or has had an impact on our society. I've had students pick like the Star Wars theme song, or We Will Rock You, or I had a student last year pick the music that happens at the beginning of every Disney movie, right? And so they talk about that and the impact of that. They analyze some of the elements, and then they create a poster around it. So I would say start small. It doesn't need to be a big, grand thing. It can be short. Have clear expectations about what they should do in class 1, what should they complete in class 2, and what should be done by the end of class 3, so that they can stay on track. Check in with your students each week as you go through each part of the project. I usually do a mini lesson based on what I'm expecting them to complete that class. So 5 minutes, I'm explaining my expectation, and then I let them work while I go around and either help students one-on-one or in small groups, or give feedback along the way. So don't think it has to be this big, grand thing. It can be small, but still have a lot of big impact.
That's a really great idea. I love that you kind of got them thinking about the music that is in their life, because what I've noticed with a lot of students is, when I used to do a project with my 6th graders, like a musical of my life. So basically they create a story where they're the center of it, could be truthful or not. And they kind of fill in the plot diagram. So there's multiple different sections, and then they have to find a song that could be used to represent that. It could be,
I love that.
But but the students, so many of them were like, I don't listen to music. I mean, or I don't do that. I'm like, I'm like, I know you play baseball. You just play baseball in complete silence when you're warming up. Like, you don't do anything like that. Oh no, we have some music
Yeah.
playing. Like, okay, cool. Like, oh, when you're playing Fortnite, what do you do? Well, I guess we listen to some music there too. And it really gets them thinking that it kind of makes it very explicit that, like, hey, there is music in your life. You haven't kind of categorized that as music necessarily, or you don't even really think about it. It's just part of what you do, which is kind of the whole point, right? That music is so
Yeah.
interwoven to what we do. So I love that, and I think that you bring up a really good point where um, giving very clear frameworks within that, not just we're going to do this, but like, all right, by this date you should have this done, by this date it should look like this. One of my first kind of diving in head first into project-based learning was during COVID, because we couldn't do anything else.
Yep.
And I'll be honest, I'll be the first one to tell you, I was so just overwhelmed with everything. I was maybe 10 minutes ahead of everyone else on the students in the lesson. So we were kind of planning it as we go, which, let's be very clear, is not how we should do this. So I love that you mentioned making it very clear, because, hey, who would have thought when I tried it again the next year and made it more specific, like this by this date, this by this date, it worked better. Who would have thought, right? So I'm glad you brought that up.
For sure. And again, it's that idea, like, you can give students freedom to pick their topics, or freedom in terms of how they want to showcase their learning, but freedom within structure, right? We all thrive in structure, especially your students. I have a toddler at home, she thrives in structure. And so giving those clear expectations is not only helpful for you, but it's really helpful for your students. And then when it comes to assessment, that's another big piece of it. So one mistake I made early on is, I'd have a time of the year where everyone's doing a project. My grade 4s, 5s, 6s, 7s, and 8s. We're all doing a project. It's all going to be due at the same time. It was great for those couple of weeks we were working on it, but then the problem is the deadline came and I had hundreds of projects to mark, right? And so that was a hard lesson I had to learn. And so I've actually really adjusted how I assess to make it more manageable, especially when you're a teacher who teaches so many students. And so, especially with these bigger projects, with the stages, I actually have marking that I do throughout. So instead of just one final mark, I'll mark, the planning, I'll mark basically the rough copy or whatever that might look like. And then again, the final project or the presentation or whatever it is at the end. And so that, for me, that ties into my curriculum, because I know it might be different for other people, but engaging in the creative process is a large part of my curriculum. So this is part of that, right? I always tell my students, your first idea should never be your final idea. You should be workshopping it. You should be trying new things. You should be applying feedback that either myself or your peers are giving you to make it the best version it can be. So when I assign the first stage, usually the first day I'm introducing the project. The second week we're working on whatever that first stage is, and then it's either due that day or it's due the following week. Whatever week that stage is due is, then I'll do my mini lesson for the next stage. I'll let students work, and then I'm checking in with them. And so as I'm checking in with them, I'm either writing anecdotal notes. Sometimes I do a quick, I do a plus, a check mark, or a minus, depending on if they're exceeding at expectations or approaching expectations. Or if it's a stage where I'm marking it, I sit with them, we go through it, and I mark it right in front of them. And I say, this is what you're doing well. This is what you're still missing. Here are some things you can think about, or what I think you should add to your final product to make it the best it can be. And this is a mark that reflects that. Do you agree? Do you not agree? So not only are you working with students and you're conferencing with them one-on-one, they're completely on the same page with how they're doing. You're completing marking as you go, and you're giving them feedback. So that way it's this wheel of creation that's happening.
I wanted to kind of go a little bit off script, because this is one area that I always struggled with, and I feel like I'm probably not the only one, which is when you're working with the student and you're kind of giving them one-on-one or smaller group support, like, how do you make sure that, like, the rest of the classroom isn't going absolute bonkers? Because I totally struggled with that. Or, like, how do you make sure they're actually working on something other than just like, hey, I'm going to be looking at it? Like, what are some strategies or some things that you've noticed that were helpful to just manage that?
Definitely. And I'm sure as people are listening to me being like, yeah, yeah, okay, how are you marking while the rest of your kids are, are working? And some classes it works better than others, right? Like, let's be real. But definitely some things that I do is how we use technology is a big factor in how engaged my students are. So at my school, we only have a few devices for each class that's allocated, but my population is able to bring in a lot of tech. So if I know we're working on something, we do like bring your own tech, and that includes headphones. So the expectation is you're sitting at your desk, your headphones are in. If they have headphones, the way that they can zone in really, increases, right? So that's a big factor. If they don't have headphones, I usually give them another alternative, like they could work in the corner of the classroom, or if there's a separate space or the hallway or whatever it might be. But having them work individually is really integral, and having those headphones is really, really key. And I have very clear expectations on how they use their technology. It stays face up on their desk. If they're not using it properly the first time, it gets put away. They realize very quickly they can't get anything done. I have also had students, who really have a hard time staying on track. They work in physical proximity to me. So I'll give them a warning. I, I have very, I give very minimal warnings. Like, I set my expectation. And again, I've taught my students for a while, so they know me. Once I've given you one warning, by the second time, you're coming and you're going to sit with me for the remainder of that class. And I'm going to check in with you. I'm going to make sure you're on track. And then next class, if you want the opportunity to work individually, then this is the expectation, right? And so it's definitely a work in progress, especially if you're new to a grade or you're new to a class or you're new to your students, right? There's a sense of trust that needs to be built up that can only happen over time and experience together. But those are just some of the things that I do.
Awesome. I think I hope that helps other people do less chaos than I had. So I'm hoping that answer right there helps some people. So we are super excited. So as of we're recording, we just opened up registration for the first ever middle school music summit, which I have to say I'm just so excited for everyone to see.
Mm-hmm.
But you are going to be giving a presentation all about project-based learning at the summit on October 19th. So for those people that might be interested in learning more, kind of what can you give a little brief overview of like what they'll get out of that lesson or that training that we might not have touched on today?
For sure. So we dive into a little bit more about what project-based learning could look like, what it can look like week by week. I give you lots more tips on how to do it successfully in your classroom, how to increase engagement, and I give you a ton more project-based ideas that you can do. And you don't need to necessarily buy resources. It's stuff that you can do with what you already have. Just to give you some ideas on how you can really engage your students and increase that buy-in and hopefully decrease some of those challenging behaviors you might get. So I always like to give little freebies too when in my session. So if you come, you'll definitely get something, some knowledge, but also some physical resources too. And it's great. Like, please come.
Perfect. We'll be sure to include the link to register to grab your free ticket in the show notes wherever you're listening. So, Alessandra, can you give us any final tips or words of encouragement, maybe for teachers that are thinking about trying PBL, and are just, they just need a little bit extra support, a little bit of a nudge?
First off, just know that you can do this. Middle school can have its challenges, but it can also have so many successes as well. When it comes to project-based learning, have your plan, have your week by week expectations, but be okay if things change, if your students need an extra week, or if you need to adjust expectations as you go along as well. You can do it. Start small, start simple, and as you gain confidence in it and as you see the benefits of it, you can start to expand what kind of projects you want your students to complete in the future.
Perfect. Before we leave, can you let our listeners know where they can hang out with you on the internet and kind of learn more about what you do in the online space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am online at Teach from the Stage. I'm on it all. Instagram, TikTok. You can visit my website, www.teachfromthestage.com. There's lots of resources there, blog posts, freebies, tons and tons of stuff. If you've listened today and you have a question or you just want to talk more about project-based learning, feel free to send me a DM, or send me an email, even teachfromthestage@gmail.com. I'd be so happy to connect. I love doing stuff like this. I love helping other teachers. And I hope you were able to pick up even one thing today that will hopefully help your teaching practice.
Well, we appreciate you so much for sharing your insight. And Alessandra, and to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. And in case nobody's told you lately, thank you so much for making a difference in the lives of the students that you teach.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I loved it.